Thank you for being here for Flexible Solutions for Safe, Affordable, and Stable Housing. I am Wynette Tasker. I'm Lumbee and Eastern Band of Cherokee. Oh, I just lost my screen. Okay, I can see the slides now. Apologies. She, her pronouns. I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And I am the Director of Partnerships and Community Engagement at the Safe Housing Alliance. We are the organization that's hosting for today's webinar. I've been doing this national technical assistance and training work since 2015. I've done a lot of tribal specific TA, which is the technical assistance, but I've also done STOP comprehensive TA, which is working with the state and territory STOP grant, VOCA grant, VAWA grant administrators at that level. Prior to working in technical assistance, I did a lot of direct services. So I worked at a residential treatment facility for youth. I worked in special education. I worked on case management for people with disabilities. And I worked at a housing and shelter program too. So with that, I'll pass it over to Sarah for her intro.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Kendall, she, her pronouns. I am biracial, Korean, and white, and I am also a survivor of domestic violence and lived experience with homelessness. I'm the Housing Stability Coordinator over here at the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, so providing TA and so training assistance, technical assistance, and all of the things related to housing for our member programs here in Washington State, and working really specifically with the DV Housing First project that is up and running, and we'll be talking a lot about it today. Prior to this role, I've been here at WSCDF for just over a year now. Came over from a local program here in Washington State where I have, what did I do there? I was the manager of our transitional housing programs, emergency shelter, rental assistance programs, and flexible financial assistance, and was working over in the direct services world for 6 years or so in advocacy, working with DV populations, working really specifically around folks experiencing substance use disorder, and the refugee immigrant population as well. So I'm really excited to be here today, and we'll be talking lots about flex funds and housing and all the good stuff.
So NASD, can you put up the second slide? And one more forward. Thank you. So with my organization, the Safe Housing Alliance, our mission is to ensure that survivors of DV and SV, so domestic and sexual violence, have a full range of safe housing options through improved access, increased resources, and innovative solutions, ultimately catalyzing a safe housing movement. Our vision is to create a world where safe housing and racial justice are human rights shared by everyone. Next slide. Thank you. So we are a part of what we call DVH-TAC, or the consortium, which is the Domestic Violence and Housing TA, so the Technical Assistance Consortium. We have our federal partners here listed, which is like our funding streams or our funding sources for all of the technical assistance providers. So for example, like Collaborative Solutions, they do a lot of the HUD, housing, technical assistance, NNEDV, they do a lot of like OVW transitional housing work, things like that. So we have these partners that we work alongside, and through the different funding streams, we're able to offer different resources, our different perspectives, our different expertise, so that our technical assistance is more well-rounded and holistic. And so if you get in touch with me and there's some things that like STARS, if you were more interested in more tribal specific housing, I would get in contact with STARS so that we could get more expertise in that area, because we really want to make sure that you have all of the resources that you need and all of the expertise and all of that knowledge. And we recognize that we can't possibly know everything about everything. So these are our project partners that we work really closely with. But I'm really glad that Sarah from WSCDIV is here on this to share her knowledge. And so next slide, I'll pass it to Sarah.
All right, so DV Housing First, or Domestic Violence Housing First, and if we can click to get these things up. So this is just a quick timeline of how DV Housing First kind of has come to be. So back in 2009, the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which I'm just going to say WSCDIV, that's like how we just make our acronym more less of a mouthful. WSCDIV partnered up with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to distribute a good chunk of change to 4 programs across Washington State to just really test out how does Flex funds affect survivors? How does it impact survivors in housing? And it was really successful over 4 years. Not 4 years, math. 2 years made like a huge impact for those programs. And so the Gates Foundation put some more money in there, expanded the cohort to include 9 programs. And there was a partnership as well with Michigan State University to do a coinciding research project to study the impacts of Flex funds and housing, and also the other components of DV Housing First, which we're going to talk about. And the study results were really promising. So over that 5-year demonstration project that was happening up until 2019, the findings were showing that Flex funds paired with survivor-driven and trauma-informed advocacy and the other pillars of DV Housing First made really lasting impacts on the ability for survivors to obtain housing, maintain their housing. There was also really promising study results around the impact that it was having on the well-being of children and safety and all the other things that we think about when we're thinking about building dignity for survivors in their households. So there was another pot of funding that got distributed and the cohort was expanded once again. And there was the demonstration evaluation project then. That is kind of where we are at now, where there was like a 3-year longitudinal study. So they tracked these survivors for 3 years and interviewed them over the course of time to see how their housing was impacted from coming into services to the end of that 3 years. And we are now at the end of the research study portion. And I'm really excited to announce that the 24-month study results, which is like the final round of the research publications, are available and published. And we can share those links at some point during this PowerPoint presentation. But that's just like a brief timeline of where we came from and where we're at today. But those findings have shown some really promising results, which we'll get into on the next slide. So some of the key findings from the pilot project, and these have also been further supported by the demonstration evaluation, where that survivor-driven advocacy contributes to housing retention, stability, and safety. Safety and stability contribute to nurturing environments for children. Housing stability and advocacy improve the health and well-being of the survivor and their families. Flexibility supports adaptability of culturally responsive services, and community engagement enhances collaboration and sustainability. And a lot of these things are things that, if you're an advocate working in direct services and working on the ground, these are things that I think a lot of us have known for quite some time. But the really impactful thing, especially for myself when I was an advocate and partaking in this research study, and now to see the tail end result, is there isn't always a lot of research that shows what we know on the ground. And so now we have data and things to really show funders and your local government officials and the people who kind of like are in charge of distributing the money for these programs to really show like this is important. Housing makes a huge difference for survivors, and there are ways that we can really improve access to housing for survivors and their families. So can we go to the next slide? So the Housing First philosophy is based on this idea and this core pinnacle point that housing is a right. It's a human right and everyone deserves housing. So when we think about Housing First, we're thinking that everyone deserves housing no matter where they're at in their journey. So saying housing first, not housing ready, is something that we like to refer to quite a bit. So thinking about, the survivors that may not have the best credit score, no matter where they're at in their recovery journey, if they're in recovery or not, no matter what's going on with them, that they still deserve and need housing, and housing is a crucial point of the ability for a survivor or for any person to maintain and obtain stability and dignity in their lives. And that being said, when we keep this Housing First philosophy at our core, then in turn, that means in our services, we should be eliminating barriers for housing access and making sure that the services that we're providing are tailored to the survivor. They're still voluntary, but really thinking about how are we, as the people who hold housing resources and people who hold such an important piece of the puzzle, how are we reducing those barriers to make sure that everyone who deserves housing is getting access to that housing? Can we go to the next slide? So the DV Housing First approach is based on 3 core pillars. So the first pillar is survivor-driven, trauma-informed mobile advocacy, the second being community engagement, and the final pillar, flexible financial assistance. And these 3 pillars are what we have come to find are, the best ways to put the pieces of the puzzle together to best support survivors and their children in rapidly obtaining housing and maintaining that housing, also with the goal of increasing and maintaining their safety and stability. And again, with the research, I'm really excited to, it's official because the results literally just got published maybe 2 weeks ago. So it's very new, the final results of the study, but it's so exciting to be able to say definitively these 3 core pillars together really make a lasting impact on survivors' ability to build their self-dignity and maintain their housing and maintain safety. Can we go to the next slide? And just defining these 3 pillars, and we'll dive into each of them over the course of this webinar, but that first, survivor-driven, trauma-informed mobile advocacy. A lot of the research project and what came to be with DV Housing First was built upon, again, work that advocates have already been doing. These are things that are really core essential pieces to advocacy, regardless if it's housing or broad survivor advocacy. And so built upon things that we already know, but survivor-driven, trauma-informed, and mobile advocacy, really focusing on the survivor's need and letting them identify their own needs rather than telling them what they need or telling them what is, the route. Mobile advocacy, meeting folks where they're at and letting survivors, again, just lead that process and choose their own goals. Community engagement, thinking about how to increase the access to resources within the community, and then also thinking about how to increase the community for the survivor themselves and their social network. And then flexible financial assistance, that's the money aspect of, how can we support survivors in paying for those tangible needs that they may have that are impacting their housing journey. And then the next slide. So with survivor-driven and survivor-centered advocacy, again, this is something that we, it's the bread and butter of DV advocacy. It's something that is a core foundation to how we operate in this field. And so it's really based upon things, again, that is a key tool in our tool belt that we all use. But it's asking that survivor, what do you need, instead of here's what we offer, and meeting survivors where it's safe and convenient for them, meeting with them out in the community, going out with them to housing appointments and to look at apartments or to join them in court or wherever it may be, and then letting survivors lead that process and choose their own goals. It's being really focused on the survivor and not the program itself, which services or in other programs where there's rule and tasks of you have to do this, and this before you can be in our program, or you have to achieve these things and graduate from this transitional program before you can get that resource that you actually wanted. So really focusing in reverse on what the survivor, looking at that survivor and orienting them as they are a whole person, and keeping that holistic sense of self as a framework of your advocacy, and seeing them for all that they are, and validating and accepting the survivor where they're at and for who they are. And so keeping that strengths-based approach and action-oriented. We all have a goal, and letting the survivor self-identify what those goals are, and then you as an advocate being there to support that along the way. And now I'll pass it over.
So we absolutely need to implement policies and procedures that make sure that racial equity within victim services, advocacy, housing, shelter programs is happening. However, the culturally specific aspect is important because we don't want to just basically house and dump our BIPOC survivors, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, just to kind of check off that racial equity box. It would really ignore the importance of that ongoing healing journey that culturally specific services is supporting. We really want our housing programs to be healing programs. So some examples of those would be the service providers and resources that reflect culture, removing that expectations for survivors to educate, especially during a crisis. An example of this is when I was working in a housing and shelter program. I'm Indigenous, and so I was smudging, which is burning some sage, with one of the youth who was living in the program. And another provider confiscated it, thinking that it might be drugs. This youth was not in a position to explain smudging, was definitely in a crisis, and should not have had to explain sage and smudging, especially during that time. And so luckily I was there to be able to intervene and talk about why he was using the sage, why I gave him sage, those kind of things. Culturally specific healing options that are holistic, well-rounded, and include physical health, your mental health, your emotional health, your spiritual health, all of those different things that make us who we are. Things that respond to not just our right now traumas or maybe our lifetime traumas, but also that generational trauma, the history of how we are who we are, how we got to be where we are, all of those things that led us to the now. And then building trust and relationship, but also acknowledging past experiences with the system. So for me, when I first sought help, when I was like 18, I needed to get out of my home that was not safe. I went to a local domestic violence, sexual assault dual program and was told basically after like a 2-hour-long intake process that they really didn't have anything for me unless I filed for an order for protection against my abusers. That is something that sent a message to me at a fairly young age that the system was going to extract a lot of information from me without me really getting any benefits from that. It was a really raw and emotional couple of hours going through that intake process really did be sent away. And so when I later started going to different services again, when I tried again, I still have that past experience, and you might be amazing and trauma informed and doing everything that I could ever want and need, but I still have in the back of my mind that this was a really bad experience for me. And it could have been re-traumatizing, and it could have been re-triggering and things like that. So knowing that, building those relationships, that there are some things that someone could have experienced that they're carrying still with them, even in the back of their heads. And then providing ongoing and interactive training for staff members around things like our unconscious biases. An activity that I like to do if we were like one-on-one or something like that, or not one-on-one, but if we were face-to-face, is kind of a word association kind of game where everyone privately does a word association where I say different survivor groups or different special needs that survivors might have. And then whoever is in the room writes down the first thing that they think of. And you might get some strong reactions or reactions that you didn't expect. And that's okay. Being aware of them, addressing them, working through them, that's really the goal. And also, if you know, for example, it might be harder for me to provide advocacy for someone who's really wealthy. I can't really relate to having that kind of money. And maybe if I can't really get over that, maybe someone else at work can work with the really wealthy survivor, something like that. So thinking about how you can work through those biases, recognizing them, and maybe there are just times when someone else works better with male survivors, something like that. And then when you think about culturally specific housing and healing needs, another thing that I experienced is going to more mainstream support groups, and they were great. I really loved support groups. But the different level of healing that I got when I was able to go to a culturally specific support group, to be able to say things that maybe I felt like the mainstream non-Indigenous, either providers or other members of the support group wouldn't quite understand, because there were cultural abuse aspects of the things that I went through. And so going to an Indigenous support group was helpful for me, because I didn't have to necessarily explain things about cultural practices or cultural stories, different things like that, that were a part of the abuse and that I needed to heal from. Next slide. Oh, can you go ahead and load that? Thank you. So we use the term trauma-informed and trauma-informed care in a lot of different ways. I really like that it's become something that's really talked about and built into our everyday lives, working in these types of fields. But I do think that we kind of get lost in what it actually means, and maybe we water down what it means or change what it means, and so our understanding kind of gets lost in there, because it is more than just being understanding of trauma. There is an awareness, and relationships are really key to understanding how that trauma has impacted lives. But you're thinking about widespread, lifelong impacts of trauma, different paths for healing. You're thinking about maybe symptoms of trauma and how that shows up for not just survivors, but also their staff members. I think that sometimes we are really quick to talk about autonomy and empowerment for survivors, but not necessarily for those that we work side by side with. You might, share an office with, that we don't really extend those same empathy for those that we work with. You're really thinking about integrating that knowledge of trauma into your policies, into your practices, into your procedures. How have you really thought through those lifelong impacts and how policies might be causing unintended harm? And then actively avoiding that re-traumatization. What kind of things might be triggering for survivors? There is a shelter power and control wheel that talks about how, as service providers, we can implement these rules that really mirror the power and control tactics. And they can come with really good intentions, but have those unintended consequences. So thinking about that. So here on our slide, we've got the trauma awareness. Relationships are absolutely key. An emphasis on safety and those potential triggers. Power sharing through choice and survivor control, and then strengths-based practices. I like to think about strengths-based practices as not so much of go out and apply for 20 jobs because we know that you need a job, but more like, what are you good at? What do you enjoy doing? What are your natural talents? What are your resiliency skills? Doing more of those things, doing more of those coping skills, really leaning into the strengths, rather than thinking about a checklist of things that we need to, quote, fix. So when you're thinking about these policies, practices, things that you're doing throughout the day, trauma-informed care really is emphasizing safety. So the physical safety, the emotional safety, the mental safety, spiritual safety, technological safety. We want to be trustworthy. We want to be transparent. We want to collaborate and recognize those power differentials between us as kind of the key holders or the gatekeepers to resources and services. And also with that, have our own humility within our responses. All right, so this slide on community or mobile advocacy. I think with COVID especially, so during the past couple of years, mobile advocacy has become more popular and more common pretty much everywhere. And it is super important for this domestic violence housing first aspect. And it's really just advocates out in the community. You're meeting survivors wherever it's safe, wherever it's convenient for them. It's getting out from behind your desk. And so even when I was doing advocacy and direct services, if youth came in, I would color with them. I would sit on the floor and grab out some coloring books and color with youth. I'd meet them at the park where they felt comfortable and safe. I would play basketball with them. It's all a part of that relationship building and meeting them where they're at, not just physically too, but also emotionally and engaging in what they enjoy doing. So part of this mobile advocacy is preparing survivors for self-advocacy. A lot of times survivors do have to self-advocate, unfortunately, especially through the housing system when it's really hard as victim service providers to understand coordinated entry through the HUD system and that housing program, that a lot of survivors are self-advocating, but working alongside them and then possibly speaking on their behalf. One of the great pieces of advocacy is being able to go to the community level or go to the systems level and be able to speak on behalf of what's happening, and being honest about it, and that level of advocacy that's really important. So next slide. So yeah, that community level of engagement, advocates can reach out to landlords. You're building relationships with those landlords, talking to them about possibly like VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, regulations in housing programs, mostly federally funded programs. You might be interacting with law enforcement, talking to them about possibly victim blaming or things like that that happen. Housing and homeless providers. How do survivors actually navigate through these systems? What could make it easier? What could make it safer? What could make it more confidential? Possibly employment programs, and encouraging them to support survivors, to understand more about what survivors go through, to understand more about that impact that has had on their lives. So there's different levels of advocacy. There's that like one-on-one stuff. There's this community stuff. And in a little bit, we'll talk more about the systems level too. Next slide. Oh, yeah. So with your community engagement, it is all about your relationships. And I would say creative partnerships is really highlighted on this slide. So we're thinking about those housing programs, which can include a lot of different programs, a lot of different organizations. You might think about like auto repair shops, gas stations, phone shops, locksmiths. What other places do survivors access? What other places might be able to offer different things for survivors, not necessarily just to meet their basic needs, but to kind of go above and beyond that so that their healing journey is safer, is easier, is supported, to make them, feel like they have an ally so that they don't have to necessarily go out and do this all on their own. You can help them avoid some of that time-consuming self-advocacy by making those relationships. Treatment centers, clinics, daycares, health and human services, youth programs, schools. You might be able to do some like teen dating violence curriculums within schools if you're building those partnerships. Job training and work programs, law enforcement, criminal justice, civil justice, those kind of legal services. And then like furniture and grocery stores, appliance stores, other kind of community resources, meeting basic needs like clothing and food banks. The more that you are out in the community, the more they'll recognize you, the more that they will understand what's actually happening, what survivors need, and their role and what they can do too. There's a lot of people who want to help, and who might not necessarily know how, or even if what they have to offer is important. And so the more we're out and about and sharing that information, the better. Next slide. So that community level advocacy involves outreach and education. Education might include things like educating around what is domestic violence, what are power and control tactics, what does it mean when we talk about financial abuse and financial justice for survivors, what does that actually mean? You might provide some education around the link between housing and domestic violence, how important that is, and the way that it's linked in both ways. So domestic violence can lead to a loss of housing, and a loss of housing can lead to more violence. There's an increased risk when you don't have safe and stable housing. And in challenges that survivors have with reaching out and getting help. It is not easy to ask for help. It is not easy to put yourself out there and be vulnerable like that. If you've ever looked at like different like social media apps, if someone discloses things, you inevitably will see in the comments victim blaming. So it's really hard to disclose, really hard to ask for help. So there's a lot of real challenges there. And part of victim blaming is, oh, survivors, they get everything that they ask for, and they have all of these resources and things like that, but it is not true. And it is really difficult to reach out and get help. Outreach activities. You might go out into the community and talk about the benefits of advocacy. Part of this is to get community buy-in. Part of this is for their understanding that the services and supports that you offer are definitely more than just this individual benefit. Housing benefits your whole community. Housing is a community issue. Advocacy involves more than just the one-on-one individual advocacy that you provide for survivors. There is more to it than a lot of people think. And then your outreach can include building those partnerships and finding new resources too. Next slide. Restoring connection. This is super important in the work that we do in our healing services and supports. We're thinking about building resilience, building that kind of self-sustainability through the increased access to different community members, community resources, community programs. Isolation is really the glue that holds abuse together. Advocacy, therefore, is combating those types of power and control tactics. So abusers like to isolate victims, survivors, because if there's no one to tell, then you're not going to disclose. So much easier to keep the abuse secret if you are isolating the survivor. So community is super vital for that restoration of a social network. It really does play a substantial role in that healing journey. It helps the survivor, it helps their children. It helps them when they're building safety plans for both the survivor and their children. The bigger the social network, the bigger the safety net that it can create. Community is also vital for that connection to resources and relationships. And again, with safety, we really want to combat this isolation through safe, trustworthy network connections and social supports. Next slide. All right, and then we have our system level advocacy. So that can include things like laws, funding, strategic planning. So under this first section of bullets, we've got tribal codes, state and federal laws, and we're really thinking about a system level advocacy around offender accountability and victim safety. With funding, we will be talking more about flexible funds here in a second. You might be advocating for an increase in flexible funds that really make a positive impact on survivors' ability to get different needs met that a lot of our funding streams do not necessarily allow for. So you might advocate for more flexible funds. You might also advocate for funding around increased capacity, increased training, increased staff. And then thinking about advocating around your strategic planning, which is a lot around those barriers. So survivors run up against a lot of barriers when they're trying to navigate these systems. So your system level advocacy might be around discrimination and biases, and things like victim blaming. So what are those myths that come up that people think about survivors who access resources, survivors who are sexually assaulted, survivors who are on public benefits? There's a lot of different myths and biases around what survivors experience. And so some of your system level advocacy can be about correcting those myths that circulate in our society. And I will pass it back to Sarah to talk more about flexible funds.
Thank you. I loved everything that you had to say, especially around just there's so many different dynamic ways of how we can engage in advocacy on these different levels, and all of them are so important, from that you're interacting with to how you get them engaged with the community, getting the community to buy into helping out and being a part of this, and then also on that systemic level. There's so many different ways that as an advocate you engage. That was like so well said. Can we move on to the next slide? All right, so the last pillar of DV Housing First, and this is kind of the favorite oftentimes because it feels the best. Sometimes, I don't know, maybe that's just me, but I remember when I was an advocate, this part, it feels good when you're like giving very tangible resources. But flexible financial assistance, also some people refer to as like client assistance or supportive assistance. This is funding to be used in whatever way will best help housing. And this can be in very direct costs like rent and utility assistance, but also thinking and expanding that idea to include indirect things that really do impact a person's housing journey, like access to childcare, access to transportation, employment assistance, and kind of anything else under the sun that really comes into someone's budget, comes into their self-dignity and their household stability. All those things make an impact on someone's housing. So when we're thinking about flexible financial assistance, really within the DV Housing First framework, it's really important to emphasize, I cannot emphasize enough, that keyword of flexible. So on the next slide. So why flexible funding? This is because we think and we know that many survivors and people avoid homelessness altogether if they have access to immediate funds that also is coupled with housing advocacy and support. So, oh, sorry, I was reading something. But our evaluations have shown that in need have immediate and long-term positive impacts. So really thinking about what's in getting new housing, or maybe it's a survivor who feels for
Okay, so looks like we've lost Sarah. And I am not sure which bullet point she was on. But, oh, there she comes.
Sorry, am I back?
No, yeah, you're back. That's okay. Do you want to turn off your video in case that helps?
Yeah, maybe I'll do that. Sorry, everyone.
No, it's totally okay.
Don't we just love when internet decides to stop doing its one job? So what was I saying? So yeah, let's see, survivors and their housing. Being able to serve survivors no matter what's going on in their housing situation, and really thinking about the very nuanced ways that there's so many different needs that survivors might have. And the immediate thought when we think about housing advocacy is usually like, let's help get their rent paid, utilities, etc. And those are really important aspects. And there's also so many other things that can be going on when we think about, you know, the survivor who has been able to maintain their housing, but all of a sudden, like, their tire blew out and they need to get a new tire, and that's like $300, and it's really going to affect their ability to pay their rent. And maybe we'll have to make a choice between, you know, getting a new tire for their car or paying their rent that month. And you know, maybe helping out with paying for that tire is going to help make sure that they can maintain their job, make sure that their children are still able to make it to school, etc. So really thinking about the dynamic ways that all these different things that are going on in a survivor's life, how they all are a piece of the puzzle to their overall housing journey and the longevity of their housing stability. And so really thinking about that keyword of flexible. And these are here on the screen are just some of those core components that we like to think about with flexible funding programs. So designing your programs to have really low barrier access to funding, survivor driven, and all the other pieces of advocacy that have already been talked about, flexibility in the funding, and swift dissemination of funds. And we'll break these down a little bit more too. So if we can go to the next slide. Here on this slide are just some examples of flexible financial assistance. These are some examples of things that we saw in the research project. These are all things that when I was an advocate and in our flexible financial assistance programs that we were paying for, but this is not like an exclusive list. So just to give examples, there are those things like rent, deposit, utilities, helping to reduce debts and rental arrears is a really impactful way that you can help a survivor maintain their long-term housing stability. You know, as we know, rental arrears, especially if someone owes rent to a housing authority, can really impact their ability to obtain any housing resources through that housing authority. So being able to help alleviate that. Transportation is a huge way to impact someone's ability to get access to resources in their community, access to work, school, etc. And so that can include things like car repairs, insurance payments for that car, license fees, driving lessons, etc. So thinking really dynamically about creative ways to improve someone's transportation access, education and employment needs, children's needs, basic needs, home furnishings. That's one that is often, it's so important. And I think especially in a lot of the federally funded housing programs, there often isn't very much assistance once you get someone into housing to furnish that housing. But that is a really important part when we think about the how do we build dignity and help a survivor feel comfortable and safe within their own home, and having beds for everyone to sleep on, how to make it feel like a home. These are all things that also make a really lasting impact on someone's ability to feel connected and safe where they're at. So these are, again, are just some examples, and there's so many other things. I think one story I always love to share is a program here in Washington that was a part of the research project, and this is a program that was in a rural county here in Washington, and the only laundromat in the area was actually over state lines in Idaho. And so they used their funding to help get a laundry machine for their survivor that they were working with. And it made a huge difference, because otherwise that survivor that, you know, didn't have access to at least consistent access to transportation, that wasn't really able to do their laundry. And laundry is a really important part of having, you know, clothes. And they were, you know, thinking about having to maybe move out of the area, but if they moved, they would be losing their community supports, their family supports, their friends, their job. And having that laundry machine actually made a really huge impact on their ability to feel like they could stay in that housing. And it's something that isn't often easily able to be paid for with some funding sources. And it's one of those things that if you can advocate for within your programming, within your contracts, to be able to really increase the flexibility of the funding sources that you have or the programming that you have to be able to cover some of these really creative and dynamic needs that survivors may be experiencing. Can we go to the next slide? And with that flexibility, having low barrier access to funding is really important, especially when we think about, I always think especially with marginalized communities where us as programs can become gatekeepers really easily of funding and of resources. And it's really important to reduce those barriers so that folks who are, experiencing the highest needs, highest barriers, and highest marginalizations can access these funds and access these resources. And your role, if you're an advocate, your role in that can really be to partner with that survivor to help assess when flexible funding can really impact their housing and make sure that you're advocating for that alongside the survivor within your programming. Having assessment processes that within your programs to determine needs that are driven by relationship rather than like checklists or just a form that gets filled out. So really having this be conversation and relationship based, all those pieces that we talked about of survivor driven advocacy, that's where this really comes in when we think about how do we do our intake processes and how do we distribute our funding within our programs, and that piece of having a conversation with the survivor and letting them identify for themselves what their needs are is really crucial. And if they're getting a checklist form that, there's only a couple check boxes there of what their needs might be, and maybe they actually have a need that isn't listed on the form, but they wouldn't know to ask for it because that's all that they see there. And so your role as an advocate really being to facilitate that conversation, offer the opportunity for just like dynamic and creative problem solving with the survivor, where they have the space to really determine for themselves what that need might be, and then again being there to assist and advocate on their behalf. And then also another area where we can reduce barriers in accessing funding is having no cap on the amount a survivor can request or limiting the number of times a survivor can request support. So, when we think about survivors that, come in and out of our services, we don't want to limit the number of times a survivor can walk through our doors. And maybe, 1 month they need rental assistance and then they're good for a while, and then something happens, a car breaks down or they lose their job and life happens. And so being able to serve survivors no matter how many number of times that they might need assistance, and also making sure that we're meeting the needs as flexibly as we can. And so when we have no cap on the amount a survivor can request, then we allow ourselves to be able to really meet survivors where they're at and listen to those needs that they might have. And can we go to the next slide? And again, just really emphasizing that word flexibility, knowing that, immediate crises can have cascading impacts for someone if they don't have a financial or social safety net. So thinking about the survivor that maybe doesn't have access to steady employment or doesn't have the strongest social network, where maybe they don't have, a strong system of support within their friends and family. One car breakdown, and I always use the car breakdown because I think it's something that most people have experienced a car issue at some point, and it's a very stressful time, and there's kind of nothing you can do about it except get the car fixed. And if you don't have a financial or social safety net, that one car breakdown can have a really lasting impact on, your ability to pay your rent, your ability to get to work, your ability to get your kids to school. And so something that is this one crisis can have a long-term impact on someone's housing journey. So really thinking about how your funding that you receive and how you distribute it across your programming, keeping that aspect of flexibility in how it's distributed so that you can meet survivors really where they're at and really impact them in their housing journeys, whether that's a very direct way of like paying for their rent, paying for their move-in costs, paying for those application fees, or indirect, like helping to pay for travel, childcare, car repair, maybe like the place that they actually do have housing and support is in a different state and they need a airplane ticket to get over there. Really opening up the possibility of how we provide survivors support. And the next slide. And the really important piece that I want to emphasize to not get lost in this is the coupling up of flexible funding with advocacy. And that's something that we really have seen in the research project is it is like these pieces of the puzzle combined that really make the longest impact and the most, the largest impact for survivors' long-term housing stability. And of course, the advocacy component is and should always be kept as voluntary. It should never be mandatory for a survivor to engage with advocacy to receive funding. But what we have seen is that having ongoing support and advocacy really is beneficial to the survivor. That ongoing safety planning, thinking about all the other needs that are coming up for the survivor as they're also dealing with their housing and making sure that they have access to the support and resources that they need as they're moving forward in their journey, that all of those pieces of the puzzle don't get lost in the sauce. And I know that it's a lot to think about, but it's just also important in really approaching the survivor again as a holistic, dynamic, unique individual. And the next slide. And that last core component, the swift dissemination of funds, this is also really important in how you design your programs, knowing that oftentimes we're dealing with, high crisis and high trauma points of time in a survivor's journey, and having funding available to be distributed within 24 to 48 hours to respond to crises is a really impactful way that you as programs can just design your program to be most beneficial for survivors. So some ways that you can do this is really minimizing the layers of organizational bureaucracy within your organization. So, if your program requires, an advocate in order to access funding has to first get approval from, a manager, and that manager has to get approval from a director, and then you have to fill out a form, and then you have to fill out another form, and then you have to go ask to get someone's credit card to make a payment. Where in that can we eliminate some of those layers and those steps so that if a survivor walks through our door and, they are on the last day of their eviction notice and it's what we have to either make this payment by 5 o'clock today or they're going to get evicted. How can we really minimize those layers of bureaucracy so that we're able to meet those needs when we know that oftentimes we really are working with survivors who are in very urgent, high crisis times. Also, another way of eliminating some of these barriers is to empower the role of advocates within the agency to be in charge of budgets or have discretion over budgets. So maybe like having lead roles within your team, like organizations where an advocate as a team lead is able to really be the one looking over a budget of flexible funding and being able to work alongside their peers in the organization to have discretion over payments that can and should be made. Knowing that, advocates on the ground are the ones that really are seeing the needs and are the holders of the relationships with the survivors that are being served. And then also that another final example being utilizing funding with minimal restrictions and parameters and offering greater flexibility. So really getting at like increasing the diversity of your funding sources within your organization and advocating for having funding that is more flexible in its like nature. So thinking about how, a lot of our federal funding sources or funding that comes oftentimes through like our state dollars can be really strict in what you can and can't pay for. There's often like really, really specific guidelines on what you can spend the money on. So where can you look in your communities for other opportunities to have more flexible funding? You know, are there foundations or private donors that you can really ramp up your like donations, asks, and requests within your organization to build up more flexible funding, or other partnership work that can be done, other grants that could be applied for, and then, or also advocating within your programs and within your systems to increase the flexibility of the funding that you are currently working with. And can we go to the next slide? So there's a lot of common challenges and concerns that come up with flexible funding, with operating any type of housing program. And one of the biggest ones that, you know, came up for me a lot when I was running my programs, and I know that it comes up, you know, quite often, is that kind of the fear of being the gatekeeper, and the fear of, you know, what happens when the money runs out, what happens when we run out of space, what happens when we're at capacity. And it's a really valid feeling to have. I think most of us enter this field because we really want to make a difference, and we want to serve as many people as we can. And something that I think is the best way to meet that and challenge that fear when it does come up within our internal selves is to remember that, you know, we are not the saviors of anyone's life, and we are here to support survivors in the best way that we can. And that means thinking about the quality of care that we're giving. And it is the reality that, you know, funding will at times run out, and there's ways that we can meet that with, you know, budgeting and having, you know, strong like internal accounting mechanisms. But meeting that fear within just acknowledging like we are operating in an environment that is at times resource scarce. We are operating in a housing crisis, I think, nationally. And those are the realities that we operate in. But we cannot operate out of a place of fear, because if we're, as service providers, being fear-based in how we run our programs, then you know, how is that going to best serve our survivors if that's the approach that we're taking? So really thinking about quality of care and letting, again, the survivor needs and survivor identified goals lead the way of how you're running your programs and how you're operating your advocacy. A lot of times there's like fears from organizational standpoints around this, like that thought of minimizing internal bureaucracy in order to facilitate like speedy payments, letting go of the reins a little bit to trust advocates or to increase like power sharing across the organization. And again, I think a lot of that comes down to fear of like liability, fear of letting go. And the way to meet that is, you know, trust building and training and increasing, you know, leadership development within the organization as well. And another common challenge that comes up is also like, how do we get the money to do this? How do we, you know, convey to potential funders like the importance of this, and how do we get our government to be on board? And that comes with just lots of advocacy and all of those pieces that were talked about earlier of, you know, how to engage with your communities, how to show up in the systems and advocate within the systems. Something that I do and I encourage all of you, again, like the research project is wrapped and our final 24-month study is out, and there's like a 200-page version of the final study, and there's also like a shorter version that is a lot easier to read. It's like 5 pages. But I would really encourage all of you, like if something you're interested in is really in engaging that like systems level advocacy, is we have this really beautiful research now that shows how truly important and impactful having these core pieces to housing advocacy, like how it all comes to play. And there's data now that shows that it works and it does have a long-term lasting impact on survivor housing. And so if we can go to the next slide. Just kind of my last piece on this is just all the gears need to be turning in order for DV Housing First and flexible funding to happen. So there needs to be in the organizational structure gear, like policies and procedures in place that support the ability for, as an organization to facilitate this work. And, how are like the insurance and reimbursement protocols working, having appropriate technology for this work to happen, when thinking about your mobile advocacy, are advocates equipped with like cell phones or laptops to be able to go out in the community and work? Is there mileage reimbursement in place so that, advocates that are driving out there can get their mileage reimbursed for the important work that they're doing? Is there, how is that like being supported internally within the organizational structure? Also with like the management roles, and is there flexibility and trust with advocates to be able to do this work, to be able to go work out in the community? And is there policy and procedure in place to make sure that they're supported by their supervisor, and there's check-ins that happen so that if they have needs that are coming up, that those needs can be expressed. So again, all those different gears need to be turning, and those are other pieces that we also think about within our organizational structures and how we operate our programs, how we design our programs to make sure that this work is able to be facilitated, able to be done in the most lasting and impactful way possible. So that's all I have, and I'll open it back up. Maybe I'll turn my camera on. Hopefully I don't like freeze out.
Yeah, can you go to the next slide, please? Because that has our contact information. Thank you. I'm going to share a couple of resources in the chat. The first one is WSCDIV's website page on DV Housing First. The second is that shelter power and control wheel that I talked about earlier. It talks about how staff can use like privilege, children against survivors, minimizing, denying, blaming, different control tactics. And so I like to encourage everyone to kind of like watch out for those kind of things, because I know that I've made mistakes, and I've not noticed certain things, and I've overlooked certain things. And when I knew better, I could do better. And so these are things that I like to share with everyone. So one reason we decided to do this webinar is we've been getting, I guess, notices from funders that there's been a lot of questions between the difference between domestic violence housing first and housing first. That when solicitations or opportunities to apply for funding comes out, that people are getting those confused. So Sarah just went over the domestic violence housing first with all of the pillars. It's the things that we've reviewed today. One of those pieces within it was just housing first, which is essentially getting people housed without them jumping through the hoops. Oh, and Sarah let me know that it looks like sent my links only to panelists, so I apologize. And I can resend those in the chat. Another reason that we wanted to do this webinar is that the Safe Housing Alliance has a flexible funding peer network group for anyone who is either using flex funds or if you're interested in flex funds. We have a listserv where we share resources, where you can ask each other questions, and we have meetings every other month. Our next meeting is January 13th, and Chris Sullivan, who is the report writer and has been essential on all of the data gathering that Sarah has been talking about with this recent report. She'll be coming to talk about the findings and the data. Yes, we will send out a copy of the slides and a follow-up email. Our flexible funding meetings are always on the second Fridays of every other month, and they're at 3 Eastern, 2 Central, 1 Mountain, and 12 Pacific. Email me. My contact information is here if you would like to join the listserv for any resources and for you to get those Zoom invites if you'd like to join the meetings. And final reason for doing this webinar is I really wanted to work with Sarah. I've seen her present, seen her during less formal meetings, and wanted to partner up with her. We will be partnering up again for a deep dive on all of this information on January 19th. It will be at 4 Eastern, 3 Central, 2 Mountain, and 1 Pacific. And it'll be an opportunity to be more interactive, less webinar, more slide, or less webinar and slides, more talking. We'll really talk through all of the aspects of DV Housing First, all of the pillars. You can ask questions. You can find out more about opportunities. As an example, we tend to get questions about documentation and justifying the flexible funds and how they're used, what they're used for, those kind of things. So we can talk through that during the deep dive. So January 19th at 4 Eastern, watch for the follow-up email when you get the slides. I will include the registration link for that deep dive, so you will all get that. And any questions?
I think we just did such a good job. There's no questions.
It's a lot of really great info, and Sarah, I'm really appreciative for you being here. As you process, as as all of the information settles, if you have things you want to talk about, like, take note of it, come to the deep dive. We can all talk about it together. You can share what each of you are doing locally. We'd love to hear about what you're doing locally, if you're using flex funds, those kind of things. So definitely feel free to come to the deep dive, share your questions with each other. The recording will, and NASD, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the recording will come to us at SHA, and we will put it on our website for it to be on YouTube. And so then I can send you a link for it to go to YouTube. Thank you. Yes, confirmation. The recording will come to me, so it can get on our website and our YouTube. Yeah. So watch for the follow-up email. Also, feel free to reach out if you have questions in the meantime. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season, and I hope to see you in January for that deep dive on the 19th. Yeah, take care.